Ryan Kmetz, subject matter expert in the climate and geospatial field. Privileged to have you on Geospatial FM.
Thanks so much, Will. I appreciate being here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
All right, so as I was discussing with you in the lead up to this, we have found ourselves on the show a guinea pig American to dip into what things are like in the American economy, how things are for the average American worker in the field of geospatial. Um, and the whole point of this is to, in the end, get to the significance of being able to be a voter to participate in elections, but in companies in the stock market via the shares that we can own. So there's a bit of a setup here. So where I'd like to start is how in America particularly, people are told that if you increase your productivity, uh, get continuing professional development, get a good degree, try hard to automate everything you do, use the latest technology. There's an assumption, perhaps a bit of a naive one though, that this will lead to great financial and economic outcomes. So I wanted to start there with our guinea pig American. Do you have any comments on this or reflections? You've been working a while.
Yeah. So when I entered the workforce out of grad school, I was told many a time, good work leads to more work, and dutifully believed in that. And um, while that's a great idiom for when you are the sole proprietor, when you're working for somebody else, it doesn't always translate over to you. So then you end up doing good work and getting more work, but you end up not realizing any of the benefit of that. Your employer does. I'm not saying do less work or do bad work because that's not the point, but it's the reality, and there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of young professionals, which I used to be. I'm now older, but who can relate to this. And whether I mean, I'm talking honestly, across the spectrum, whether it is white or green collar, even some blue collar folks can relate to this. It doesn't always equate to a bigger paycheck for you. So keeping that in mind is, how can we have discussions around what does it mean to be able to take ownership of your work and to exert some influence into your financial well-being, both in the near present and then I'm sure we're going to start talking about 401ks or 403bs, depending on how your work's set up, but what that looks like.
Okay, all right. So the message I'm getting is that yes, do everything you can to increase your productivity, but don't be a naive participant in the process of generating economic returns from that productivity. There's a chance that you might give up more than you have to in your contact with the economy using your highly productive approaches. In particularly geospatial, but it goes for any discipline. Okay, so I think there's a few observations to make along the way here. So what I see as an outsider, I'm the alien from Mars that's just pulled into Earth's orbit from my amazing spaceship. What I've heard, bubbling up in the airwaves, um, is education in the US particularly is incredibly expensive. And it's kind of a problem that's, gotten more so over the decades. I hear at one point it used to be a heck of a lot cheaper, even free, or at least there have been some discussions from some leaders that actually it's possible to make it free. And that is the case in some other countries as well. Another few observations here to sort of fill out the picture is that particularly recently, cost of living has dramatically increased. Inflation is contributing to that. So this makes the issue of a lack of wage growth even more painful to bear. Uh, there's also an emerging trend or some another issue that bubbles up in sort of the national conversation more and more is the problem of living paycheck to paycheck. I've dug into this a little bit. There are some really scary statistics on this and some less scary ones. So the fact check that I've seen is that on the one end, there's a loan or a credit card company that says that the people that they polled around 2000, that's of the order of 60% of them were living paycheck to paycheck. But then there was, I think, a study from the Federal Reserve or some national financial body from the government, which said it's more around 34%. But regardless, that's still a significant millions upon millions of Americans that really they're on the hamster wheel economically. They're not really going anywhere. Um, so how do those reflections? What do they mean for you as an American?
Sure, and I'll to the listeners and viewers, I'll put in context. I am of the millennial generation, the millennial cohort. Um, I don't claim to speak for all of them, but the majority of people I know are millennials, and this is kind of how we have viewed things. Is that we grew up being told you have to go to college to get a good job. So a lot of us went to college and got through college. A lot of us graduated right or somewhere in plus or minus a few years of the 2008 economic crisis in America. And there were no jobs. And we were then told, well, now you need a master's degree or a PhD, a lot of us. Um, so a lot of us said, okay, let's go do that. And we get out of that and we look to see jobs out there, and you're seeing starting salaries that are $55,000, um, and while you have over $100,000 in student debt that cannot be refinanced and is at a high interest rate, and so you start to become disenfranchised right away. And I remember very early on in my career talking to a good friend and mentor who was trying to explain to me how all the savings stuff worked because I didn't know how retirement worked, and his advice was, set aside an extra $1,000 a month into your savings, and I was just like, I can't uh, be by paying off loans and just the cost of living, whether it was car insurance, car or apartment. I said it's not possible.
Okay, so
Yeah.
what I'm hearing, again, as this newly arrived alien from Mars in my nice air-conditioned spacecraft with great views, is that you haven't rejected my characterization of Americans, the average American's contact with the economy. It does appear that cost of living is high. You mentioned that often, at least an American from your generation, will be newly minted into the worker class with a significant debt. I didn't think about that one. Another thing to add into the mix is that I hear housing is quite expensive. It's a significant multiple of your annual salary to buy the average home these days. So yeah, it seems that um, from the perspective of achieving the high productivity that you need to get a job in this economy. To achieve that, you need to pay a lot of money. And so most people go into debt. And then once you get your start, the salary in the end is quite low. And to begin to live as a normal person, so to have a house, it's quite hard even to get into that because you have a huge loan to service, which reduces even more the quality of house that you could afford on this low salary. So it seems like the average American is being kind of, what can I say, pressed from all directions. It appears.
And to just add into what
Yeah.
you're talking about, Will, recently there was a story about Maxwell House, which is a common coffee found all over America, and how they're actually thinking about, or maybe they're rebranding to Maxwell Apartment. And the thought process there was actually because that resonates better
Oh no.
um, with Americans, because more Americans are having to live either in apartments or a rent situation as opposed to home ownership.
There's no clearer expression of the situation. That's yeah, what you call that's a downsizing of the American dream, then, is it? It's
Yes.
yeah, going from a house to an apartment. Okay, all right, yeah, that's a great way to sum things up. Um, so then I guess something to talk about also, as another signal emerging from the population, is that over the weekend, actually, there was the largest protest by some accounts in American history. It was called the No Kings Rally. There was something like 2,700 sites across the US, of the order of 7 million people, if you trust those who did the counting. So uh, there are many reasons why people go to protests like that. Nevertheless, at a high level, when that proportion of the population is out in the streets, and you have these issues to do with cost of living, living paycheck to paycheck, extremely expensive education, extremely expensive housing, low salaries. It's maybe a good idea to take a step back and just wonder, if a change in how we participate in the economy is necessary. So let's sort of draw a line under that. And I wanted to maybe search back in history a bit for when there were similar sort of protest movements, revolutionary movements, occasions when people had reason to protest. And again, in the lead up to this, in our preparation for it, it appears that from your own family history, there was a great, great, great grandfather whom we might be able to learn from here.
Yes. So he Jacob was his name, and he was actually Lithuanian, but back then it would have been part of Russia. This is the 1860s, 1870s. And he was part of an anti-czarist revolutionary group called the People's Will.
That sounds like no
Um,
kings.
yes, 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 and he may or may not have been tied to. They had a revolutionary newspaper where they were voicing kind of their dissent and also their plans. Got him in trouble and got sent off to Siberia. Um, then the family story is that he bribed a guard and somehow made his way to America. Um, but the whole where he actually then opened up a newspaper stand in New York City outside of Columbia. So he was a newsman his whole life. Uh, but kind of the point of that is throughout history, there have been times where the populace was upset with the status quo, and they realized that the de facto state of the economy was much different than the de jure state of the economy, and
Well,
people
I'm sorry, I don't
decided.
understand those two terms.
So, they're fancy terms. De facto meaning, in fact, what's happening, and de jure meaning in law. Um, so what I'm trying to say is, while if you look at official channels, um, from a de jure perspective, at the American economy is doing great. Inflation, the war on inflation right now has been defeated. That is the official line. Where in fact, that's not what most Americans are experiencing. And so to kind of move the story forward a little bit, um, that what we saw there kind of ties into what you saw at the first Gilded Age of America in the early 1900s, leading up to World War One, and even post World War One, with a lot of the troops saying, "Hey, we want our benefits. We're not getting our benefits." Um, then, of course, the Great Depression. But uh, what I'm trying to say is, throughout even recent history, there's been lots of times where folks were talking about the issues and then trying to solve the issues, sometimes through peaceful protests, sometimes not so peaceful. But that even though the times right now are extremely turbulent, history is cyclical, and you can see throughout history, whether it's now or you want to go all the way back to the Roman Empire, it's cyclical, and it's basically it's just that sine. How big's that sine wave and that
Yeah.
peak, and what's it going to
There's
look like?
Yeah, there's such a parallel really to what's happened recently. I mean, we've had probably the most clear sign of it being similar to what your great 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 grandfather went through, was Jimmy Kimmel being pressured off the air, for basically a week. And this is an example in modern times of the press, the media somehow being pressured or being silenced, in a similar. And you mentioning that this man went to Siberia, and then came to New York and saw newspapers. I mean, it's a real hero's journey, but it's such a, in a way, it's like such an expression of the common role or place for America in the world. For the rest of the world's population, in a way. Sorry, so was that? Did you say in the 1700s?
1870s was when that would have happened.
Okay, amazing. All right. Have you ever been to the street corner in New York City, where he
I
must
have
have?
not.
Okay, we'll have to do that sometime. If we ever meet up in person, that'll be great. Okay. So who was Uncle Benny?
Yeah, yeah. So, in the lead up to this, Will and I were talking a little bit about interesting factoids, and this one is more on the social justice front. But he would have been my I think either great or great great Uncle Benny. He was essentially the facilities manager for the Dyckman Oval in New York City, which is where it was a racetrack, but also where some Negro leagues played. And my family, most of my family was from New York City, and I actually remember looking at my grandpa's. Uh, you and I would call it a yearbook. They called it something else back then, but his high school yearbook from New York City, and he was in an integrated classroom, um, which this would have been in the 1930s. And then hearing stories too of my mom growing up and lived in Levittown, Long Island. And for those of you who don't know what Levittown is, it's actually the first suburban planned community. They popped up after the war, and mom would tell us stories of how, I guess in the late 50s, early 60s, an African American family moved in, and there was a lot of racism. And my grandfather pulled the three kids aside and said, they're the same as us. You treat them the same. Um, but kind of talking about where, from a social justice or racial justice standpoint, is we're seeing very similar things in America, where that unfortunately there's certain demographics feel that other demographics shouldn't be here. And really, when you start, everyone's probably like, what does this have to do with geospatial? And but if you start to think about how that shapes the economy and what that looks like, is are we, I'll use de facto again, are we de facto keeping folks out of the economy, even though de jure they're legally protected to be in it? But is the color of their skin or where they're from actually causing an issue? Um, I hope that answered your question.
Okay, so tell us more about what Uncle Benny did in that context.
He basically kept fixed fixed stuff, make sure that the grounds were ready. But what was interesting is he was very social, with the New York Cubans, who were the Negro League baseball team that played there. One of them, and so in that context, you look at it, you're thinking 1930s New York, and here you have a very very pasty white dude hanging out with people that the majority of America viewed as lesser than, for no rhyme or reason. And the direct tie into that today, honestly, is there are so many frontline communities located throughout the well, everywhere, to be honest. I'm very familiar with the US, but looking at those frontline communities and seeing the inequalities that they face, and the fact that you look at the federal data sets, the federal government's erasing environmental justice data. They say it doesn't exist, or it shouldn't exist, rather. I mean, it obviously does exist. Um, but looking at how we're excluding those folks from even understanding the impacts of whatever it may be is on them. So how can we, as an industry, make sure that we are encouraging folks from those communities to to be part of our industry? How can we make sure that they're active participants in the geospatial field? How can we, or if they are, how can they give back to their community as well? How can they do very simple um, volunteer work or pro bono work with their expertise? Because a lot of times, uh, frontline communities can really benefit from somebody who knows geospatial, and they
Mm.
don't need anything. They don't need a 40-hour project. Usually they just need to know, where can I find the data? What does the data mean? And can you make a map that I can click on it so I can go to my city council or whoever and say, look, this is the data from the state or the city. It shows that this place is polluting us. This is how many people live here. Why aren't you doing something to fix it?
Yeah, okay. So there's a couple of themes I can pull out here. So we can make a reference to a guest who's come on the podcast twice, Frank Romo. He is a fantastic inspiration and a leader in our industry for how you can use GIS in the course of community organizing. Another topic to mention is redlining. And how this was used to take advantage really of vulnerable communities. Another theme is that in times of populism, in populist times, often, unfortunately, what can happen is that these vulnerable communities can be set up as the scapegoat or be the focal point for broader community rage to do with other things. For example, what we were discussing at the beginning, excessive cost of living, the fact that people have not been fairly compensated for what appears to be, according to the Niskanen Center, a 97% increase in productivity since the 1980s, but only a 19% increase in median salary. So, of course, that will make people angry. And unfortunately, cynical political leaders can direct that anger opportunistically towards the vulnerable, whilst continuing the exploitation that makes people angry. So, I am perceiving that your message here is that you have in your family history somebody who humanized vulnerable groups rather than exploiting them. And you have a reminder amongst your ancestors that really it is not what the populist leaders, the demagogues say. These people are still humans, and we need to think more clearly and more carefully about really what's making us angry. Am I getting there in my understanding of
Exactly.
what?
Yes.
Cool. Good. Okay. It sounds like we indeed can learn from our ancestors here, Ryan. And I think, yeah, you're showing how having some awareness of your family history can really serve you. Okay. So who was Upton Sinclair?
Yep. So not as far as I know, not a family ancestor, but Upton Sinclair was an author. He famously wrote a book called The Jungle, which talked about the Chicago meat industry in the early 1900s, which really highlighted um, a lot of health and safety issues, for lack of a better term, and exploitation of the working class, and has direct parallels to today, both at the U.S. level, but also internationally, about how folks are, um, because their economics straits are so dire, they are willing to take whatever work that they can get their hands on, and then they feel happy that they have a job. And that sets up this cycle, unfortunately, of exploitation where, okay, you know, they're happy they have a job. The job market is slim, so that's the best they can do. They're not going anywhere, so we can say you need to work harder or longer, but we're not going to pay you more. And you can work in deplorable conditions, but you can't do anything about it. And so Upton Sinclair's whole novel actually brought about a huge change in the food processing industry. Um, it's essentially like if you've heard of reporters who go undercover in communities, and it was basically that only in the early 1900s version of that. And the direct parallels to today are you're seeing a very similar structure of where a lot of folks are being forced to participate in what we call the gig economy, which sounds great on paper. Oh, you're your own boss, but you're at the mercy of you're not really your own boss. You're at the mercy of whoever owns that contract, and then you're excluded from a lot of health and safety protections. So you're seeing a similar setup, just with modern conveniences, modern technologies. Um, and that goes in perfectly into what Will and I were talking about in lead up to here that Will would like to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, so what was the name of the book again?
The jungle.
The Jungle. All right. So, I mean, that's actually a nice way to summarize my career. I have sort of been macheteing and scrambling through the vines of the world, from Australia to Cambodia, where I was an Engineers Without Borders Australia volunteer for a urban poor community advocacy NGO in Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. Uh, the jungle there was that there were tens of thousands of vulnerable Cambodians who had been victimized over decades, sort of starting with the Khmer Rouge, which was a genocidal regime which evicted essentially the whole population of Phnom Penh, the capital, sent them off to, worker camps, and unfortunately, a significant number of them ended up in what's called the killing fields. Utterly, unspeakably traumatic and terrible, for the population. And, years later, after these people, some of them were displaced from this capital city, some of them made their way back to the city, only to find that their houses were occupied, and they couldn't live in them again. And also for various other reasons to do with the lack of a viable economy, in the city. People congregated, on the sides of railway tracks, on the sides of roads, anywhere there was some open space, um, uh, and lived in these improvised shacks. Urban poor communities is a term. People might say slums, but the more politically correct term, is urban poor communities. So what was, I guess, shocking to me, is that, this country, which had seen decades of, depravity and violence and exploitation, still in this, modern day and age, was again victimizing these people and sending them out of these urban poor communities tens of kilometers, 50 kilometers away from the capital city, to some dodgy relocation site, with very little financial compensation. Yeah, so this was sort of the first exposure that I had to how the world conducts itself, outside of the heaven, comparatively speaking, that is Australia. Um, I carried on this international career, going to another trouble spot, Kuwait, where, in the early 1990s, there was Gulf War One. There have been a few. And I guess really the main traumatic sort of result for that population there, was the Iraqi forces in their retreat after the invasion, detonating between 600 and 700 oil wells, across Kuwait's oil fields, resulting in fires that lasted for most of, I think, 1991. And there was a multinational firefighting force, including a Hungarian tank, with jet engines on it used to extinguish some of the fires. So you can just imagine, the black smoke, the pollution, just the terrible scene that population had to deal with, and the psychological effects down the generations even. So yeah, what was I doing there? I was on an environmental cleanup project. The company I worked for, Amick Foster Wheeler, was involved in one cleaning up these sludge pits, effluent pits, gouge pits, oil disposal pits, basically holes in the ground created and used in the course of extracting and transporting crude oil. But in parallel, there was another project cleaning up all the oil lakes, explosive remnants of war, so basically unexploded cluster bombs and other things that were the result of that war. So there was a general large cleanup effort that I was a part of when I was there, and that was actually a great source of pride for me. But in parallel, sort of accompanying that, and what sort of came to sort of psychologically eat me up, is that there was vast and shocking exploitation of the poor in the oil field. So you talked about Upton Sinclair frankly commenting on how the poor had to accept horrific working conditions because there was really nothing much better for them. They didn't have any bargaining power, basically. So that is what the oil fields are in Kuwait. You've got people from Bangladesh, people from Egypt, people from Pakistan, Nepal, India, Filipinos. So these countries, they are beautiful. I've traveled to several of them. India, incredible. I've done a motorbike tour through the Himalayas. I'm not here to write off those people, those economies, their vast and awe-inspiring history. We know there are incredible religious movements, for example, that have swept the world that have come out of India. But one must acknowledge that the economic conditions there are not fantastic. And therefore, there is a flight to safety, as it were, from those economies to places like, unfortunately, the oil fields of Kuwait, where salaries are astronomically higher than what they could get, but the exploitation is horrific. So working hours are very long. There are no labor unions that are allowed. And as a result, the death rates in industrial accidents, construction accidents are horrifically high. And they came to traumatize me, which is maybe a horrifically insensitive and entitled thing to say, that I should even think that I have a right to talk about the trauma that it caused to me to know about this. But what can I say? Somebody has to say something, and my role that I can at least, the little power that I have in this situation is, from my point of privilege, to talk openly and honestly as much as I can about this horrific exploitation. So the one that really stuck with me, if I can possibly even categorize these things or put in a hierarchy the unnecessary death of anyone. The main one was on a gathering center, which is a crude oil processing factory, basically. It's essentially a tower of pipes. There was an Indian worker who used his site access in the North Kuwait asset, which is an oil field, which is almost adjacent to the border with Iraq, who used his site access on what would have been a Friday night to hang himself on the pipe rack of this gathering center, to be found on a Saturday morning, because they work 6 days a week. And in Kuwait, actually, the working week starts on a Sunday for regular people who do 5 days a week, and on a Saturday for people who do 6 days a week. So this man, I don't know why he hung himself, but taking the step of not, and this is, allow me to, I'm sorry to speak in such horrifically open and blunt terms about something like a suicide. I'm sorry to do this, but to choose specifically to hang yourself, not anywhere else, at home, I'm sorry, but, but specifically to travel from the work camp where he was. I don't know how he did it, but to choose to travel at night to the place of work to use his access card to get into the construction site and to choose specifically to hang himself on the pipe rack of the factory that he was building is a deliberate act, and very, very difficult for me to characterize as not being a workplace related incident. Well, what happened? What happened was the operations director for AMEC Foster Wheeler in the Kuwait branch got up in front of us during a town hall and said to us that it was characterized as not being a workplace related incident by the client, the Kuwait Oil Company, and that he, as the leader of that office at AMEC Foster Wheeler, acquiesced and agreed with the client about that characterization. And he did that. He felt that he could act with such impunity as to do that in front of the 300, office workers for what was supposed to be a top 5 engineering design consultancy in the world, at the time. And that to me was basically it. I submitted my resignation by email. I included the CEO, the head of HR, needless to say, for the company. And things went from there. But what happened was I submitted a whole set of ethics point reports about various other horrific, in any other country, safety incidents, and other examples of corruption and fraud. And the result apparently was that the global compliance lead came down from London to Kuwait. He told me on the phone that he would do this. And he also said during that time that he would meet with me. Well, he never did. And he did, though, call me when he got back to London. And he said that all of the things that I had reported were not found to have a basis. When, I'm sorry, but the operations director had stood in front of us and falsely declared something to not be a workplace incident of the sort that I've just related to you. So it was a chaotic, incredibly traumatizing, and left me with a profound sense of guilt that I had not managed to stop the most horrific of abuses. So talking about the jungle, yeah, the modern jungle. And things continued from there. I had a stint in Qatar. The main thing, just to summarize, is that in working for Qatar's Public Works Authority, also known as Ashghal, I was testing a field data collection solution for the drainage network. Specifically, we were trying to use their high accuracy positioning, so continuously operating reference system, which purported to offer centimeter level accuracy positioning. So we were going around to a few sites in the drainage network, construction sites, to test how accurate it was. And we came across a manhole excavation that was 10 meters deep, so a significant excavation. And it had 2 Indians standing at the bottom, wielding hammers against some iron reinforcement. And this excavation was not shored. So what that means is there weren't any reinforcements around the wall. It was just bare earth, right? And it was a shocking scene to me, because on the other side, we were standing on one side, obviously, on the other side, there was evidence of subsidence, in this deep excavation. And simultaneously, so there was actually an accumulation of material that had fallen off the wall of the excavation at the bottom, and yet there was still this Indian man running around the bottom, helping with the construction of this thing. And I asked the project manager who'd taken me there, why haven't you shored this this excavation? And he said, oh no, he said dismissively, we've got a geotech report which says that the ground is compacted enough, and he was saying this in front of me, whilst before my eyes was evidence that this geotech report was incorrect. So the jungle in Qatar uh, was like that. Um, and then the last experience of fighting through the jungle of exploitation in modern times was when I worked at Jacobs as a principal geospatial consultant, a moment of intense pride. Again, it has to be said, in my career because I was working in the UK headquarters, beautiful office on the Thames. We saw HMS Belfast out the window. Sort of moored since World War II. We saw the Tower of London across the river. Lunchtime, I could go on a 40-minute walk across Tower Bridge, past the Tower of London, over London Bridge and back. That was, past some of the most significant, tourist spots in the country, was my lunchtime walk. And there was some absolutely amazing projects that I was involved in, as this principal consultant. I was involved in a carbon capture and storage project. So, as part of blue hydrogen production, there was some amazing, constraints analysis and feasibility studies with onshore and offshore stuff, and I'd never done offshore stuff before, so it was fascinating. I was also involved in Project Union, which was a feasibility study to build up a thousands of mile hydrogen transition backbone for the whole of Great Britain. So, some fantastic stuff. Simultaneously, however, similar to, this contrast between the pride I had worked for Amick Foster Wheeler on a very large environmental cleanup project in Kuwait, there was undeniable exploitation of the poor and a very powerful organization turning a blind eye to this. So a project that Jacobs was and still is a delivery partner on is called NEOM, which at the time was proposed to be a 170-kilometer long straight line city in northwestern Saudi Arabia. And the funny thing is, I'd already been headhunted or attempted to be headhunted twice by recruiters in Dubai for this project. And, I was actually quite taken with it initially. I was really excited. It was all about sustainability, walkable cities, removing the car, great stuff. But what I found out in literally about less than 2 hours of due diligence on this is that the Saudi government had evicted tens of thousands of indigenous landowners from Tabuk province where NEOM was being built. And not only that, right, and there's a connection then to the beginning of my career when I was a volunteer with Engineers Without Borders in Phnom Penh. Um, there was a man that was shot dead in the course of evicting those landowners. And at the time, there were 3 men put on death row who had also protested their eviction. And ALQST, an NGO, has said that in fact it's 5 men that are on death row. And what killed me is that no one in the leadership at Jacobs was talking about this. No one was leading a process and telling the workforce that they were leading a process of causing justice for these men and their needless they're needlessly being threatened with death. And what was happening was that the leadership were just barreling ahead with extracting as much money as they could from this project and hoping that they're not showing any evidence of caring for the plight of these men would sweep up the workforce in just getting on with the work and ignoring the human reality. So this is my brief tour of the jungle for you, Ryan.
I appreciate that recap, Will, and I apologize that you've dealt
And
with
you're
all
an
that.
American, by the way, so it's
Yeah,
meaningful to tell this to an American because America is supposed to be our freedom and liberty, justice.
it is. It is. I mean, what you're actually describing sounds very similar to the plight of millions of First Peoples, Indigenous peoples in America and what they went through in the 1800s. Um, And so, I mean, it's unfortunately tying back to what we were discussing, history just repeats itself again and again and again.
As I said in the lead up to, or in the introductory comments to do with this episode, the whole point of this is to get to an understanding of the meaning of being able to vote as a shareholder on how these companies should be led. The lead into this concept of share ownership is not the profit motive. It's not Wolf of Wall Street. As much as I love Leonardo DiCaprio's acting, it's not for reasons of greed or necessarily becoming stinking rich or filthy rich that I am proposing that we have an interest in the stock market. It is actually a part of participating in a democracy and gaining some power to elevate, actually, companies and leaders that are engaging in great conduct. An example I have is Arcadis. Funnily enough, the leader of Arcadis started his career as a surveyor. So I like the fact that we have one of the large engineering consultancies who's led by one of us. But something that makes him even better to me is that he has recently decided to exit Arcadis from the Middle East because of the usual observations about human rights issues. Another one from a frank financial perspective, he said, is that often uh, clients there are very late to pay. Anyway, so it can actually, just from a pure financial standpoint, not be a great choice to earn income or try to earn income in the Middle East. So I want to say that what we can do here is use our power and our understanding about how the industry works to highlight great conduct, to celebrate that, to elevate those people, and to share the understanding with our colleagues about potentially great employers, companies where you'll feel truly from bottom to top, inside and out, incredibly proud to work at that firm. So that's another way that we can use our power here as participants in the stock market. But another one is basically to engage in shareholder advocacy campaigns, which is a kind of legal action, really, where you use your rights as a shareholder to correct the leadership of some companies. Maybe there's fraud, maybe there's some sort of misconduct, maybe there is exploitation of the poor to a truly egregious degree, which diminishes us all. Yeah. So I don't see any reason why we shouldn't fully grab hold of that opportunity and assume that power as the labor force that the stock market allows us to have. And it's really interesting to me to see that there really isn't coordinated action. There's no community organizing in terms of the labor force's participation in the stock market and control of the publicly traded companies that, in fact, they can have if there is some sort of coordinated action in this way. So I see there's a gap. I propose that we fill that gap with an awareness service.
I think that's an absolutely splendid idea, and that's why I hopped on board with this effort. And I mean, I want to help folks understand too who might think, I only own one share. Well, one share gets one vote.
Exactly.
Um, and so if there's, I'll be optimistic. If we get 50,000 people to subscribe with this, and half of them care about the ethics, that's 25,000 shareholders voting yay or nay, or voting for Joe Smith versus Jane Doe. But that's a significant number of people to leverage. And
Yes.
I also want to add that it's um, like I said at the very beginning. I mean, you can buy fractional and buy your way up really if there's a stock that you really want to own, but it's $400 a share.
You can
Well,
get fractional shares in
but
Robinhood. I think several brokers, yeah, even interactive brokers, yeah, allow fractional share ownership. Yeah,
and then you can eventually own that full stock.
yeah,
Um, and so that's something that I think is really, really appealing, very interesting thing. And as you mentioned too, also characterizing who are the good companies to work for, and then by building this community, kind of doing where a certain online networking, professional networking website doesn't always work so well for us, is building this community where you get to know other folks who might be able to help you land your next job.
yeah. Okay, yeah, and if we could be known actually by the leaders in our industry, um, as celebrating, promoting, and rewarding great leadership, I think that's how we can also be a service to the industry. What I'm really proud of here, the universe works in mysterious ways, but I've managed to get a guest in you, Ryan, where you can say in a multi-generational sense, you can refer back several generations in terms of your ancestors, to someone who showed the way.
Yes,
Yeah.
agree.
And that, through all the hardship, I mean, in terms of history, it's kind of the worst kind of hardship, or one of the worst, to be sent to Siberia. But there was hope for that man, because in the end, he found his way to, a street corner in New York, one of the most famous cities in world history, out the front of Columbia University, one of the best in the world, especially in terms of investing in finance, actually. Some of the most famous, most successful investors were actually trained at Columbia. So this man went through incredible hardship. He stood up for what was right, and look where he ended up. All right, Ryan. So as I said, I've been this alien from Mars, cruising around Earth's orbit, observing what is going on. I like this interesting conversation that I've been able to have from an inhabitant of America. Thanks for the incredible conversation. I think, as this Martian, I might stick around and do some extra work for you guys on this thing called the stock market, and how we can begin to dig in and learn who the leaders are, what all the companies are, and what the opportunities are for assuming a position of leadership as the labor force, as the workforce in these companies, and to become known within the industry amongst the leaders, as a force with legitimate concerns and who is willing to assert themselves. So, Ryan, I'm excited for the next episode, where we're going to characterize what's been done, and how we can put AI at the center of that, and turbocharge these efforts.
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation. I'm looking forward to chatting with you again, and sharing with folks what you and I have been working on behind the scenes, what this episode was meant to lead up to.
All right, looks good. Looking forward to the next one, Ryan.
Yes, me too, Will. Thank you.